I'm really proud to introduce Evan Goer. He's a former Yahoo. He's written an awesome book. I encourage everyone to go out and check it out. And so without further ado, here's Thinking of Documentation as Code with Evan Goer. So let's give him a big hand.
Thanks. Wow. Thank you, guys. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Evan Goer, and it's really great to be back. So a little bit of background. I'm a former technical writer, now a full-time front-end engineer at Intuit. We are the makers of fine products that help people deal with their pain in their financial lives, such as TurboTax, Mint, and QuickBooks. And I also wrote a book. All right. So, thinking of documentation as code, I actually have an alternative title for this talk. I'm including this title for kind of a serious reason. I think that we all naturally and rightly want to make fun of the idea that there even is such a thing as a simple trick or tip that will help us in something as complicated as writing documentation or software engineering. As some of you know, I'm not a big fan of airy statements about writing. So you often hear writing advice like, be clear or write short sentences. And there's similar advice floating around there for software engineering for that matter. I mean, clear writing, well-crafted software. Who doesn't want those things? The problem is that these are just platitudes. They don't actually help us make decisions. They don't help us in real-world situations. So, it's one thing to say, be clear. It's another thing to say, well, how exactly do I be clear? And what does being clear really mean? So rather than statements that we kind of repeat to make us feel good or feel some sense of solidarity, I think it's more important to focus on, maybe there's something out there that's simple that like a guideline or a heuristic or a razor that we can apply. For example, Occam's razor says, among competing hypotheses, choose the one with the fewest assumptions. Now that razor could be wrong, we could apply it incorrectly, but at least that's actually something useful that we can use to help us make decisions. So I'll start out with a fable. It's kind of a weird fable, but bear with me. So imagine you are a software engineer. That's not the weird part. You and a couple of teammates have just been handed a legacy project to maintain, and you look at the code and, oh my God, there's no tests at all. Okay, that's not the weird part. But your boss comes in, and you're sitting around there being depressed and despondent, and your boss says, people, I have this awesome solution. I've been on the phone with a vendor, and the vendor has this awesome repository for your unit tests. It's going to store all of our unit tests, and it has this built-in version control system, and it's got built-in workflow and access rights. And, oh, this is the best part, guys. Wait for it. They have their own unit test editor. So all of your unit tests, you're going to edit in this proprietary thing. No, unfortunately, you can't use your favorite editor, but it's okay because this built-in thing is awesome. What do you guys think? So what would so you hear this from your boss. So just imagine you and a couple buddies sitting around. What do you think your reaction would be? I know at most software engineering teams how they'd react. I mean, it's insane, right? Like you would never, ever, ever store your unit test that way, and you would probably kill your boss with your laser beam eyes if he suggested such a thing. And yet people are constantly doing this, right? They're constantly doing this with documentation. The story I just told you is not that far off from what's acceptable with your docs. So to that end, here is our heuristic, or our razor for today. To first order, software documentation is like code. I can't take credit for this idea. I'm sure it's not original to me, and it's something that while I was working as a technical writer sort of evolved over the years, and I was only able to really clearly articulate it in the last few years, and I found it to be incredibly useful once it was concrete in my mind, and it's even useful now that I'm not doing documentation full time. In fact, if anything, it's even more useful. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at this very simple heuristic, and we're going to apply it to a bunch of situations and see how this can help us make good decisions about how to manage your documentation. And we'll also poke at it a little bit. We'll find a couple places where the analogy doesn't quite hold. In fact, I'll point out one of those areas right now. This heuristic really applies when you have software engineers writing documentation, either partly or in full. So if you have an army of technical writers or the support team or someone else who's responsible for writing documentation, what I'm about to tell you doesn't really apply so much. All right. Another way of phrasing our heuristic is it is the radical notion that documentation is part of your product. It's part of the whole, just like any other code or metacode in your project. And the really nice thing about thinking about documentation this way is you already have a lot of experience. You already have years of experience working with software, and so it turns out that a lot of the instincts that you have, that you've built up over the years working with software, apply really well to documentation. So let's start with a gimme, an easy one. Where should documentation live? Should it live in a knowledge base? Should it live in a wiki? Raise your hand if you have your documentation in one of these places. Go on. You don't have to be ashamed. Okay. More hands going up. Okay, so let's apply our heuristic. So to first order software documentation is like code. Well, where do we store code? Well, we store code in Git. We store code in a hosted modern version control system. And we do that for a bunch of good reasons. We do that because we have very powerful version control features. We get collaboration, we get backup, we get code distribution. We get a lot of good stuff for that. And it's really quite powerful. The reason these systems are so powerful is because they've been evolving for decades under a lot of close scrutiny. And so now they're pretty good. And we as software engineers know how to work with these systems. By contrast, as soon as you take your documentation and put it somewhere other than version control, now you are allowing yourself to use all of these features I just described, but in a crappy, watered-down, enterprisey way. There's no way that a dedicated system is going to duplicate all of the power that you already have at your fingertips when you're using a modern distributed version control system. So the other thing besides watering down the features that are really powerful, there's a much more insidious thing, which is that as soon as you move your documentation into a silo, then editing code is a normal thing, and editing documentation is this weird, alien, special thing. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is the best way to accelerate documentation rot. Let's apply our heuristic somewhere else. So does it make sense to create documentation source in some kind of binary proprietary format? It sounds a little bit crazy, but people actually do this all the time. Let's apply our heuristic to first order documentation is like code. And once again, we immediately know the answer. We can just cut right to the chase. We know that we write code in plain text for all sorts of good reasons. We can edit it in any editor. We can slice and dice it with a huge array of utilities that have built up over the years for manipulating text. And as soon as you say to yourself, hey, I'm going to accept that my documentation is a proprietary format, FrameMaker, OpenOffice, God help you, Word. I mean, as soon as you do this, now you're cutting yourself off from the whole tool chain that you're familiar with. There are documentation systems where the source format is in Flash. I wish I were joking. If you choose a proprietary bind for your docs, you cut yourself off. You basically are saying, only through this special tool can I do anything with the documentation, and everyone on the team gets immediately less productive. And that's assuming everyone on the team has a license to actually edit your stuff. Let's apply a heuristic to something else. Code is very expensive. You can't just sit there and type lots and lots and lots of code and expect the project at the end of the day to work all that well. We know that the more code we write, the more bugs we have, the slower things get, the harder things are going to be to maintain. And the exact same thing is true for documentation. In fact, documentation is even worse. So when you are about to, I don't know about you, but when I'm about to commit code or push code, I get this little fluttery sensation because I know that that code, it's not just playing around anymore. That's now expensive. That's going to have consequences. Like someone, maybe myself, maybe someone else is going to pay for whatever mistakes I just made. And whatever feeling you have like that, you should feel that double for documentation, because documentation, unlike code, is almost impossible to regression test. So for code, I can write a unit test harness, I can write functional tests, I can have at least some level of assurance that I haven't screwed things up when the code changes. But documentation, there are only a very small number of automated tests you can set up for documentation, really. I mean, automation, like one thing you can do is use spell check. Please use spell check, please. Like Vim has spell check, seriously, so like you can run spell check. But aside from that, and there are code, documentation generators like Javadoc and Doxygen. That's some form of automation. But for the most part, the only way to ensure that your documentation is correct and maintained is to have a bunch of human beings reviewing your documentation constantly, which is very expensive. So a corollary of docs being very expensive is that given a choice between writing lots of documentation or fixing your code, fix your code. I used to run into this all the time as a technical writer. I would be working on some documentation and I'd be struggling because this piece was really, really hard to write, and I would go to the engineer and say, this is really complicated. What could we do about this? And the engineer would say, oh, well, we could do X, Y, and Z. And he or she would disappear, and then tomorrow, my workload would be cut in half because they fixed the underlying problem that was making it so hard to describe. Having to write lots of complicated documentation is a code smell. Part of a technical writer's job, if they run into this, is to call this to your attention. But if you don't have a technical writer helping you, you should train yourself to pay attention to this. That pain you're feeling as you're writing the documentation, that's actually diagnostic pain. Go back to the coding phase, go back to the design phase, rethink. Our examples include, are you writing installation documentation? Is it incredibly long and complicated? Could the installation be maybe 3 steps? Could you reduce it down to 1 step? Or are you kind of bored out of your mind documenting some huge API? Ask yourself, why is the API so huge? Do I really need to expose this huge public surface to the API? Does the world really need all these secondary methods? Maybe you can chop it down in half. By the way, my absolute least favorite documentation in the world is the developer setup wiki. Who's familiar with this genre of documentation? In fact, I'd like you all actually to raise your right hand. Please raise your right hand, and I want you to take a pledge. Repeat after me. All right. I state your name. Do so solemnly swear that I will never write a dev setup wiki page again. That I will use install automation tools. That I will use containers. That I will use VMs. And I will automate that shit. So help me, $deity. Thank you. Thank you. Good job, guys. So speaking of crappy wiki pages, I've developed a bit of a reputation among friends of being cranky about wikis, or maybe just a crank. I want to back off of that a little bit. I don't hate wiki pages. I actually think wikis are useful as a general purpose tool. But part of my problem with wikis stems from the fact that they are a general purpose tool, and I am a big documentation tools nerd, and wikis tend to lack some of the semantics and some of the features that I'm looking for in a documentation system. However, there's no reason that a wiki couldn't provide some of these features, and some of them do. Another sort of minor problem I have with them, it's not such a minor problem, it's the editing process. So if you're going to spend hours kind of in the zone trying to write documentation, it's really unpleasant to be working in a browser text area, typing into some glorified random jQuery plugin all day. I mean, that's not a lot of fun, right? But again, browsers can actually expose pretty nice writing environments. We actually have full-blown development environments that people have written in browsers that actually work decently these days. So again, a wiki could, a well-designed wiki could adopt a better writing interface that would be easier to use for longer periods of time. And some of them do. Another option would be having the wiki treat offline editing as a first-class citizen. So you could check out the files and edit them in whatever editor you want and push them back, and that's entirely equivalent to editing through the browser. And again, some wikis sort of approach this. So in fact, GitHub wikis are actually pretty close to what I'm talking about. They actually do have some nice technical documentation features, and they do tie the documentation source close to the project. So now we're actually talking about something that I think is useful. So my main problem with wikis, the real problem, is what I described earlier. If the wiki means your documentation is siloed away from your project, that's disastrous. That's like kind of the root of all evil. But if the wiki treats your documentation more like code and more like part of your project, then wikis are not necessarily so evil. By the way, so YUI has been producing their documentation, I think the right way for quite some time, ever since Celic and YUI.doc came out. But interestingly, jQuery, the jQuery project just went through this pain themselves this year. So they previously had a wiki-based system, and they moved over to a Git-based system, their own doc builder system, very similar to YUI and a lot of other projects. And it's a huge improvement. Their docs are much more cohesive, and their contribution model is now send a pull request or file an issue. And in fact, they have a big fat button on the bottom of each page to that effect. So I think that's awesome, and I think that's a great job by the jQuery doc team. All right, another sort of special problem with documentation, user comments and documentation pages. Again, this is something, so an analogy. You are writing a module, you maintain a module, and you want to allow people to contribute to your JavaScript module, and you say, how about this? How's this sound? We will let anyone on the internet append any method they like to my module. How does that sound? Like they can't clobber what we've already written, but they can append whatever. Does that sound good? Does that sound like a... No, it's a terrible idea. Terrible, terrible, terrible idea. But you see mature projects doing this all the time. PHP.NET is sort of infamous for this. PHP has great, they have a dedicated doc team. I think that they have a huge task ahead of them because PHP is so big. I think they do a pretty good job of documenting core PHP, but for years they've allowed these user comments, and the user comments contain bad advice, insecure advice, deprecated code, and it's just kind of sitting there to trap the unwary. And it's not just old, established, mature projects. I have here on the screen a screenshot of AngularJS, very new project. Exciting stuff, really interesting, written by smart people. But documentation is not exactly AngularJS's strong point at the moment. And they're not helping themselves by allowing user comments. So the user comments are basically people, if you read them, complaining about the low quality of the documentation. This is something that they could fix. Like, this is just wasted pixels. Or to pull another very recent example, React.js. Again, really, really interesting project written by very smart people. They're doing really interesting things with DOM performance. But again, if you go to a React documentation page, guess what? They all have Facebook comments attached, which is even worse than the AngularJS comments. I mean, at least AngularJS is using Discus, so that's something. This mistake, which keeps repeating over and over and over, happens because people are not thinking about their documentation as if it were part of their project. Comments are clearly the wrong way to contribute to the project. The right way is what YUI is doing, what jQuery is doing, and what most projects who have wised up are doing, is use the same contribution process that you're already using for code. Because documentation is expensive, you want to add it judiciously, and you need a balance. So if you think about code, we talk a lot about separation of concerns, and that's true when you sort of branch out into documentation. So what to write and what not to write? Well, your code covers the what. It covers what actually is going to happen. And if your code is well written, people can read it and get like a decent sense of the how. Like, how does this work? How might I put this together? But code almost always does a really bad job of covering the why. Like, why does this work this way? Why did the designer make these choices? And so documentation fills in the gaps. Documentation is good at talking about the why, and it's good at talking about the how, and it can be good at talking about the what, although then you're getting sort of some duplication. And some of that duplication is okay, but you really can't avoid talking about what the software does. Particularly if you've got like getting started guides or tutorial material, you have to say like what is this thing? What does it do? But the most valuable documentation you can write is on the right-hand side, trying to cover that how and that why. In particular, focusing on why and how will save you from writing really, really bad API documentation. So I think we're all familiar with this concept. We have a method that's named getConnection, and the API documentation for that method is gets the connection, right? This is really painful for everybody, both the person who wrote that in the first place and those of us who have to read it. So the solution to that is think about the yellow thing, think about the right, think about the how and the why. Why would I call getConnection? How would I use it with other methods? These are, how does it work exactly? These are the kind of questions you should be asking yourself, and if you do that, you will write actually useful API documentation and not be wasting your time or anyone else's. Do not repeat yourself. So since we're always running the risk of duplicating information when we write documentation and cover the what and the how, so let's put on our developer hats and think about how we can apply the principles of dry to documentation. So one obvious place is JavaDoc and documentation generators. So they will generate a skeleton from the structure of your code, and that structure should be, at least that structure will be correct. Okay, maybe the doc comments are a pack of lies, but the structure is right, so that's something. But other examples, so you could have code examples. Could those code examples be reused? Could they be broken out of the documentation and run as part of your test suite? And in fact, I think YUI does this already, which is awesome. What about docs for command line tools? So I love it when there are great, like fancy arg parsers that will not only handle the arg parsing for your command line tool, but also automatically generate a usage statement. I think that, particularly if you're writing a small command line tool, a little Node.js program, your instinct might be, you know what, I don't need to drag in this thing. I can just parse the arguments myself. I have only a couple arguments anyway. It's not a big deal. And I think often that's, the do-it-yourself spirit is not necessarily a bad thing. But in the case of argument parsing, I would ask you to rethink that instinct and think about using a fancy arg parser that will do this, because this feature is really cool. You're actually driving the documentation from the structure of your code, which is, I think, a really good thing. Dry concepts in documentation can actually be much simpler than what I'm describing. A simple cross-reference, for more information, see section whatever, blah, blah, blah. That is a form of reuse. You're not grabbing and copying and pasting stuff from that other section. You're just saying, for more information, go to the section. Or glossary entries. You can have a glossary entry that auto-links back to its definition. Again, that's a form of reuse. Other forms of reuse, you can actually, if you're really smart, you can, build your documentation for different platforms. You could have, people do this for different OSs. They'll have the Windows version and the Mac version and the Linux version of their documentation with minor variations, and they just reuse that text rather than copying and pasting it. Or if you can parse your documentation, you can pull out little snippets and you reuse it as like tooltips in a GUI or inline help, and then also have it in a larger book. You're developers, right? The sky's the limit if you can parse your documentation. Finally, I'd like to talk about build targets. I think, I love man pages. And I think that the secret to creating multiple formats really is, I think as front-end engineers, we're all a little bit brain damaged in that we think HTML is like easy to write and read. It's not. It's a pain. Like that should not actually be your authoring format. A good authoring format is something that's more abstract, something that will compile to HTML. So something like Markdown with extensions or restructured text. So you can take these formats and then generate new form. You can compile them down to these different formats. And just as an example, rather than having an HTML hyperlink that's hard-coded to point to some location, you can have an abstract cross-reference. And that abstract cross-reference, if you compile it to HTML, it becomes a link. But if you compile it to LaTeX and PDF, it becomes, for more information, see section name on page 117. So in a different context where a user might want to print out your documentation, the cross-reference works just as well. And if you move the section or change the header name or whatever it is and rebuild the docs, you get the answer. You get the cross-reference still works. So that's about it. This is just a sample of the different ways you can use this heuristic. Not only can it help you avoid wasting lots of time going down rat holes like user comments, but it opens up a lot of possibilities for what you can do with your documentation. Documentation is holistic. It's part of your project. It is not some alien thing. And the more that you think about it as software, the more you can apply the principles that you already know and make your documentation better. That's it. You can reach me at my email address or on Twitter at Evan Goer, and I'm also Evan Goer as a username on most places on the internet, so you can find me there too. That's it. Thank you very much.
So we do have time for questions, so let's fire up some questions for Evan.
Thank you. So you actually then would recommend to use Markdown as the source, because that's something we're struggling with internally, exactly all those points. And right now one question is, okay, which should we choose? HTML or Markdown? And I'm leaning towards Markdown, but just want to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Markdown, the question with Markdown is always which Markdown, because core Markdown is kind of a subset of HTML4, and what most people find is that most documentation systems that are built on top of Markdown will extend it a little bit. Yes, I definitely recommend using a more abstract format. So Markdown is good. Restructured text, which is sort of a cousin of Markdown, is also really good. These, and the reason they're good is because is twofold. One, the reasons I just described, that they give you the power. They don't make any assumptions about what the output format is, so they give you a lot of flexibility about how you want to publish your docs. Do you want to do single-page HTML, multi-page HTML, PDF, TROF, EPUB, Kindle, whatever. But the other thing that is really important, and I think that's why this is why people gravitate to Markdown when they write their READMEs in GitHub, is because, quite frankly, it's a lot easier to read and author text when a paragraph is 2 new lines rather than open P, close P. And where a bullet list, it's a lot easier to kind of scan the page and find problems and type this stuff when a bullet list is star line of text rather than UL, LI, line of text, LI. Even for front-end engineers, we have this problem. I think that even though we're really used to staring at HTML, if you look at the equivalent Markdown, it's just easier to read and easier to work with. So you'll be more productive writing in Markdown. Any other questions?
All right, next question. Do we have more questions for Evan? Hey, Evan, I have a question for you. Oh, there's one.
So you mentioned that there's several good forms of documentation that's kind of self-improving. For example, the Markdown files on GitHub, the Java docs, and that adding user comments to those kind of sections are a little bit degrading to that kind of documentation. Do you think there's a way you could implement user commenting on documentation so that it was more productive than harmful?
I don't think so. I thought about this, and I think that user comments really, the best way to deal with them is to harvest what's good and throw away what's bad. Because when people are desperate enough to actually read your documentation, they don't want to wade through long comment streams, right? Like the comment stream, like again, if you look at like the PHP comments or the AngularJS comments, like every once in a while there's something in there like buried down 3, levels that is, maybe a good comment. But what you really need is some vetting. You want to say, okay, we are the core people of the project. Just like any software contribution, if someone sends you a pull request, you can either accept it or reject it or send them back for more info. If someone files an issue, you can look at the issue, you can accept it, work on it, or reject it, or get into a conversation. But that's kind of stuff, all that sort of back and forth, that belongs in the shadows. That belongs in IRC or issues or forums. When you actually add more pixels to your documentation, that stuff should all be vetted. And we as software developers have really good processes already for like dealing with contributions from the world. So user comments don't really do anything useful. They're a way to harvest user feedback, but we have much better ways of pulling out the good stuff, making sure the rest of the world sees it, and like rejecting the crap.
All right, and I had a second part to that as well. One of the reasons that Markdown is more helpful as a documentation language is because it's so easily transformative. It can be, as you said, out to PDF or to HTML, on and on. How do you feel about XML as a documentation language in the sense that XLST can, transform it into HTML as well, or?
Totally. Good question. So I have a surprisingly long background with XML-based documentation formats. I wrote a lot of documentation using DocBook XML. And DocBook XML, I think, was the right answer before we had lightweight markup formats. So DocBook XML, I could do a whole other talk about that. It's a beast. It has an enormous number of features. And what you end up doing with a Markdown-based documentation system is you end up doing a bunch of work to kind of like add more features to Markdown because you don't quite have what you need, and like generating your build system and parsing things the way you want to do it. And DocBook is more of an enormous system that's already handed to you. It ships with enormous XSLT style sheets that will do a whole bunch of things. The problem with DocBook XML is it is a monster. It has, I think, the DocBook 4 schema has something like over 400 elements, and I don't even know how many attributes on those elements. Like you have to be someone like me, a professional technical writer for a number of years to like wrap your head around like what you can even do with DocBook. So I think it is like more than you want to bite off. But if you actually need the power of DocBook XML, because it does do a lot of things that a simple, small Markdown based system does, you can go to that. If you want something that's more powerful, restructured text and Sphinx are kind of like a more grown-up. So it's a similar language to Markdown, but it has a lot of tech writery features built in. The disadvantage of using restructured text and Sphinx is it's completely a Python stack, and you have no choice about that because there are no parsers for restructured text other than the Python one. So if you like Python, I actually do. If you like Python, Sphinx and restructured text are pretty good, and you can hack on it and do all kinds of cool stuff. If you don't like Python, if you don't want to get into that, Markdown with some extensions is kind of, and with your own a little bit of customization, that's kind of the only game in town, I think. Yes. Any other questions?
I have one for you, since I have the mic. How do you mentioned code rot before. How do you deal with documentation rot when you've got a lot of people working on the code, they're focused on the code, and they're supposed to write documentation, but a lot of times you'll read things that have not changed for years, even though the code itself has evolved.
That's why documentation is painful to work with. It's that very principle that you can't really, like unlike code where you can kind of wrestle code to the ground with a test harness, you can't really do that with docs. You have to continually be watching and maintaining them. I guess one thing I would say is, so you can do a couple of things. One is like try to write less documentation. I described some ways you can, if you fix some problems in your code, you might be able to get away with less documentation. The other thing is try to write your documentation as you go. I know this sounds really painful, and you want to like put off the documentation and maybe like sneak off without writing it in the first place. But write your documentation as you go, because again, when you do that, you will feel that pain of the documentation being difficult to write, and that will help, and you will go back and fix some code and reduce the amount of documentation you produce in the first place. If you already ship your code and then write your documentation, that forces you to write a lot more documentation, and then you have to maintain that documentation, and it'll rot faster.
All right, I want to thank you very much, Evan, for talking with us today. And I want everyone to note that all the talks that we have for YYConf will be available on video, so definitely check out the video as well. So thank you so much for speaking today.
Thank you.